Most stars live their lives in the glare of flashbulbs, but few ever feel the crushing weight of that light the way Whitney Houston did. She was not just a singer, she was an archetype, a living embodiment of the contradictions that define fame in America. Her voice carried the promise of divinity, yet her story whispered the warning of destruction. Imagine a woman crowned as the voice of a generation, and yet trapped in a maze where every step forward brought her closer to the edge. The public adored her, the industry consumed her, and the world dissected her downfall like a spectacle. But behind the gossip and the headlines lay truths rarely spoken, secrets about her final years that reveal not just who she was, but what fame does to those who embody too much brilliance for the world to bear. Whitney's decline was never a straight line. It was a spiral, one that reflected the larger cultural tragedies of race, gender, and power in America. To be Black and brilliant in a world that both worships and fears you is to constantly negotiate your very existence. Whitney became a symbol of assimilation in her early career, the crossover darling with the perfect smile, yet she carried within her the voice of gospel fire, the sacred cry of a Black church that refuses to die. Her success was built on smoothing those edges, making her palatable to mainstream audiences. But as the years passed, the tension between who she was and who she was forced to be carved wounds into her spirit. When you hear her sing, you are not just hearing talent, you are hearing survival. In her final years, those wounds became visible. She was haunted by the reality that her image had been manufactured and consumed, while her authentic self withered in the shadows. Have you ever noticed how society loves to crown a Black woman as queen, only to relish tearing her down when she stumbles? Whitney lived that cycle. She became the shining model of Black excellence, but when the pressures of addiction and pain surfaced, she was reduced to a tabloid punchline. The tragedy was not only hers, it was cultural, systemic, inevitable in a world that thrives on spectacle. By the time the last chapters of her life unfolded, Whitney had become both participant and prisoner in her own myth. The drugs were real, yes, but the deeper addiction was to the impossible expectations placed upon her. To sing like an angel while living in hell, that was the paradox she carried. And in her final years, that paradox grew louder. Those close to her spoke of a woman oscillating between moments of divine clarity and devastating despair. It was as though she was being pulled apart by two forces, the celestial destiny of her voice and the earthly weight of her pain. Do you know how many icons fall not because of a lack of talent, but because the very brilliance that lifted them becomes their curse? Whitney was such an icon. The rumors, the whispers, the mocking interviews, they chipped away at her. And yet, even in the fog of scandal, her presence commanded awe. Step into any room with Whitney Houston in her last years, and you would still feel the energy, the aura of someone touched by something greater than human. The tragedy was that she no longer believed in that aura herself. What people rarely admit is that her story was never just about drugs or relationships, it was about betrayal. Betrayal by an industry that used her, betrayal by a culture that judged her, betrayal even within her closest circles. Trust, for Whitney, became a fragile thing. She gave so much to the world, but the world gave her back only fragments of love, often conditional, always precarious. And isn't that the cruelest fate for a woman who gave us some of the most unconditional songs of devotion? Her final years were not merely a downfall, they were a mirror. They force us to ask, what do we demand from our icons? Do we love them as human beings or only as symbols of our fantasies? Whitney's story makes you confront your own complicity. You listened, you applauded, you consumed. But did you care for the woman behind the voice? Most didn't. And in that silence lies one of the greatest secrets about her decline. It wasn't only personal. It was cultural, communal, a wound that belongs to all of us. The truth is, Whitney Houston's last years were not simply a cautionary tale of excess. They were a testament to the unbearable weight of expectation, the suffocating cage of fame, and the cultural contradictions of being a Black woman in America's spotlight. She carried all of it until her final breath. And as you listen to the echoes of her songs now, you realize that every note was a prophecy, every chorus a cry for freedom that the world never allowed her to fully claim. Whitney's decline was not just a private tragedy, it was staged, scripted, and broadcast. Every stumble, every relapse, every whisper of her fragility was turned into entertainment. Yet the most haunting secret about her final years was that Whitney herself knew she had become a character in someone else's narrative. She could sense the way cameras lingered on her with voyeuristic hunger, how headlines reduced her to caricature, how even her attempts at redemption were framed as spectacle. And in that knowing, there was both rage and resignation. She once commanded stages like a queen, but now she found herself forced to play the role of fallen monarch for an audience addicted to watching women collapse. Fame is crueler to women than to men, and crueler still to Black women. Whitney had been the golden promise, the crossover dream, the evidence that America could crown a Black star and call it progress. Yet, like so many before her, she was placed on a pedestal built on fragility. The higher the pedestal, the harder the fall. In her final years, she carried the weight of this paradox, to be idolized as proof of perfection, while being denied the freedom to be imperfect. The music industry did not just sell her records, it sold an image of flawlessness, one that had no space for addiction, heartbreak, or rage. But Whitney was flesh and blood, not marble and gold. The cracks showed, and once they did, society delighted in pointing them out. Imagine the sound of her voice, once compared to the clarity of a church bell, struggling under the strain of time, substance, and sorrow. Audiences who once rose to their feet in ecstasy now whispered criticisms. She's lost it. She's a shell of herself. She'll never be the same. But what they didn't understand was that Whitney's cracked voice was more than decline. It was testimony. It was the sound of a woman who had given everything, and still it was not enough. There is a kind of beauty in that rawness, the kind that only those willing to look past perfection can recognize. Have you ever considered that greatness is not about maintaining an image, but about bearing witness to your own truth, however broken? In her later years, Whitney oscillated between moments of luminous clarity and shadows of despair. Those close to her described her as deeply spiritual, still anchored by the gospel roots that shaped her. She prayed, she sought redemption, she wanted to reclaim her narrative. Yet she was also pursued relentlessly by demons, both internal and external. Every attempt at a comeback was sabotaged by whispers of her past, by the constant presence of substances, by the fatigue of carrying a body that had been wrung dry by decades of exploitation. She was not just battling addiction, she was battling the ghosts of her own legend. And then there was the question of love. The public consumed her relationship with Bobby Brown like a soap opera, a toxic union replayed endlessly on screens and magazines. But what people rarely acknowledge is that Whitney's longing for love was never satisfied, even outside of that marriage. She wanted a love that saw her not as an icon, not as the voice, not as America's sweetheart, but as a woman flawed, tender, searching. Instead, she found herself surrounded by sycophants, opportunists, and users. In her last years, trust became nearly impossible. Imagine being Whitney, not knowing who loved you for you, who stayed because of your power, or who lingered in the shadows waiting for you to fall. That loneliness was perhaps more destructive than any drug. Culturally, Whitney's unraveling symbolized something larger, the way Black brilliance is consumed. Think of it, the church girl who conquered the charts, the Black woman who dominated pop in an era that often excluded her kind, the beauty whose image adorned magazine covers across the globe. Yet her story ended not with reverence, but with ridicule. This is America's cycle: exalt, exploit, discard. And Whitney's tragedy fit neatly into that narrative. Her secrets were not only her own, they belonged to the culture that built her up and tore her down. Yet even in her decline, she radiated. Walk into a room where Whitney appeared in those last years, and though her body may have been frail, though her voice may have trembled, there was still an aura that silenced the air. Her presence remained that of a queen, a reminder of what she had been and what she still was beneath the ruin. That is the complexity of Whitney Houston's final chapter. She was both fallen and untouchable, broken and eternal. The world mourned her when she died, but few reflected on the fact that her death had been rehearsed for years in the public imagination. The spectacle had prepared us. And that is the most chilling truth. Whitney was already gone in the eyes of many before her body ever left us. She was consumed piece by piece until only fragments remained. Yet those fragments still shone with something indestructible. There is a shadow that lingers in every tale of fame, the betrayal that doesn't come from lovers, friends, or even rivals, but from the machinery itself. Whitney Houston's final years exposed this in brutal clarity. The industry that once called her its crown jewel now treated her like damaged goods. Record executives whispered about liability, promoters worried about ticket sales, and networks hesitated to trust her voice live on. It was as though her humanity had become a risk factor. What you must understand is that fame has no loyalty. It adores the rise, feasts on the downfall, and moves on to the next bright flame without ever looking back. And Whitney, once adored by the world, now lived in the twilight of that betrayal, the betrayal of being disposable. But betrayal ran deeper than industry greed. Those around her, the so-called inner circle, often blurred the line between love and control, protection and exploitation. Friends became managers, bodyguards became confidants, and family became entangled in her finances. Who could she trust when everyone had something to gain? Whitney longed for a sanctuary, a safe space where the name Houston wasn't currency. Yet in her final years, that sanctuary eluded her. Instead, she was surrounded by people who benefited from her fragility, who stood close enough to shield her from total collapse but never far enough to let her heal. Have you ever felt that kind of loneliness? To be crowded by people, yet utterly abandoned? Then there was her body, carrying years of abuse, not just from substances, but from the relentless pressure to perform, to tour, to deliver. The image of Whitney Houston as flawless was never meant to last. But when reality surfaced, the world recoiled. Society has little mercy for a woman aging under the spotlight, and even less for a Black woman expected to embody perfection. As her voice wavered, headlines mocked her. As her beauty weathered, tabloids feasted. Her decline was treated not as a natural part of life, but as a scandal, a tragedy to be consumed. And yet, Whitney bore it with a strange dignity. There were nights she sang through the cracks, her voice frayed but her spirit fierce, reminding audiences that imperfection can carry its own power. Spiritually, Whitney was still reaching upward. Gospel never left her, even when drugs and despair threatened to pull her under. In private, she returned to prayer, to church songs, to whispered hymns that anchored her in ways fame never could. But the battle was constant. The substances were not just addiction, they were anesthesia, numbing the ache of betrayal, silencing the screams of a body and soul that had been overused by an unrelenting world. To some, these final years looked like weakness. To others, they revealed a warrior who kept standing long after most would have fallen. Which truth do you believe? Her relationship with her daughter, Bobby Christina, was one of the few ties that gave her a sense of continuity. Yet even there, pain lingered. Whitney carried guilt, the guilt of a mother who knew her battles spilled over into her child's world. She wanted to protect her daughter from the same traps. Yet how could she when she was still ensnared? The cruel symmetry of their fates would only be fully realized years later, when Bobby Christina's life ended tragically. But in Whitney's final years, you can imagine her both hopeful and haunted, desperate to be the mother her child needed, even as the shadows of her own demons loomed. Culturally, her unraveling was not just a private affair. For Black America, Whitney had been a symbol of crossover success, of Black excellence polished for mainstream consumption, of a dream realized in an industry that often shut doors. Her decline mirrored a collective wound, the realization that no amount of success, no level of brilliance, can shield you from exploitation. The betrayal of Whitney Houston was not simply personal, it was historical. She bore the weight of centuries of expectation, and when she faltered, the world acted as if the promise of progress had cracked with her. Yet even in her last days, Whitney could still surprise. There were moments, captured in fragments, where the laughter returned. That radiant, infectious laugh that lit up rooms. There were nights she sang softly to friends, proving that the gift, though scarred, had not vanished. There were flashes of the woman who once declared she would always love us, still there, buried under years of pain, but not erased. These moments remind us of a haunting truth. Legends do not simply vanish, even when they falter. They linger in echoes, in fragments, in the spaces between triumph and tragedy. And so, the seventh secret of Whitney's final years is perhaps the most devastating. She never truly belonged to herself. From the moment her voice stunned the world, she was owned by labels, by the public, by family obligations, by the relentless gaze of fame. In the end, the betrayal that haunted her legacy was that she gave everything, but the world never let her simply be. There is a cruel poetry in the way legends are remembered. For Whitney Houston, the world clings to two images: the radiant goddess in a white gown belting the national anthem, and the broken woman, her voice faltering, her life unraveling. Between these extremes lies the truth of her final years, a truth the world prefers not to face because it says too much about us. We are drawn to rise and fall stories, addicted to the spectacle of brilliance turned to ruin. But what does that say about our own hunger, about a culture that exalts its icons, only to watch them collapse under the weight of our expectations? Whitney's last days were a study in contradictions. She could still walk into a room and command attention, laughter spilling from her lips, beauty radiating despite exhaustion. And yet, just hours later, she might retreat into silence, weighed down by inner battles no one could soothe. It is said that in those days she oscillated between hope and despair, clinging to the possibility of a comeback even as she sensed time closing in. The image of her final public appearances, sometimes radiant, sometimes trembling, reflect that eternal duality, a star both shining and flickering. But let us step back from the headlines and look at the deeper story. Whitney Houston's decline was not just the tragedy of a woman. It was the tragedy of an entire system that exploits Black brilliance, repackages it for mainstream approval, and then abandons it when it no longer fits the mold. From her early career, Whitney was marketed as the perfect crossover, her gospel roots polished into a pristine pop icon for white America. That packaging came at a cost. She was often accused of not being Black enough, as though her very identity was something to debate. Imagine carrying that weight, being both too much and never enough. In her final years, the betrayal of identity cut as deep as the betrayal of fame. There were whispers of love that could have saved her. Friends and confidants claimed she longed for something more authentic, more real than the spotlight allowed. Yet authenticity is dangerous in a world that thrives on illusions. Whitney's longing for genuine connection often collided with the necessity of performance. The people she trusted most often needed her to be Whitney Houston, the star, not Whitney the woman. Have you ever felt that, being valued for what you represent rather than who you are? Multiply that feeling by millions, and you begin to glimpse her prison. The night of her passing was surreal. She died just hours before a music industry gala, her body upstairs in a hotel room while the party continued below. That single image encapsulates the betrayal of fame. The show must go on, even as its brightest light extinguishes. While stars and executives mingled, cameras flashing, the woman who gave the world some of its greatest songs lay lifeless, her story closing in silence. Can you feel the coldness of that moment? It is not just tragedy, it is indictment. Fame consumes, and when the feast is done, it barely pauses before moving on. Yet, even death could not erase the brilliance of her gift. In the years since, her songs still rise on radio waves, in films, in quiet rooms where someone presses play to remember what it feels like to be uplifted. Her voice, powerful and aching, carries the paradox of her legacy, beauty born from suffering, resilience woven into every note. Whitney Houston's final years may have been filled with betrayal, but her art remains untouchable. She may have stumbled as a mortal, but as an artist, she transcends. And here lies the final secret, the one nobody talks about. Whitney's story is not just hers, it is ours. It is about the cost of idolizing perfection, the cruelty of turning people into products, and the hunger that drives us to consume their pain as entertainment. Her downfall mirrors our complicity. We loved her songs, but did we love her? We adored her beauty, but did we honor her humanity? We demanded her best, But did we give her grace when she faltered? These questions haunt her legacy, and they should haunt us too. In the end, Whitney Houston stands as both a cautionary tale and an eternal flame. She reveals the fragility of human greatness and the resilience of spirit that refuses to vanish. She is the reminder that legends are not flawless. They are wounded, complex, and profoundly human. And perhaps that is where their true power lies. Not in the illusion of perfection, but in the raw truth of their struggle. Legends may fall, but their truth always rises.